While there's always been some contention as to where exactly the dark age of Sonic began in the mid-2000s, there is almost no question that 2005's Shadow the Hedgehog was most certainly the most prolific representation of it.
Shadow had been an extremely successful and loved addition to the Sonic canon with his introduction in Sonic Adventure 2. While there were dissenters to his inclusion, as there always are with most changes to the series, it's safe to say Shadow was certainly a popular inclusion, quickly rising to the top echelons of Sonic characters and knocking Knuckles down from his position as main rival to Sonic.
Still, by only 2005, just 4 years after his debut, what started as a potentially deep and effective character had been flanderized into the try-hard edgelord we know him as today. While he's certainly a very popular and sought-after character in the grand scheme of the series, his star had also fallen quite a bit, along with much of the supporting cast after Sonic 06, when Sonic Team decided to take a much more Sonic-centric approach to the main series. For a time, it felt like Shadow was going to be relegated to a relic of his time, an interesting take on the Sonic series during a time of broad change and shifting tone within the series narrative, and nothing encapsulates that time better than the game that bears Shadow's name. Shadow the Hedgehog was the first main series Sonic title to accrue a largely negative reception from critics, with only a few outliers like Nintendo Power and game trailers breaking from the pack with surprisingly, and if we're being honest, probably undeservingly high scores. Despite this, the diverse opinions and tastes of the Sonic fanbase make it inevitable that nearly any game in the series can and will have its defenders, and Shadow the Hedgehog is no exception. That said, those who stand by Shadow are generally less notable or vocal about their opinions on the title, versus more prolific games in the series with mixed to negative reviews like Sonic 06.
Perhaps this is due to its darker bent that doesn't lend itself to the type of timeless gaming experiences a lot of the more lighthearted Sonic titles do, or even 06 that balanced it more in the tradition of the adventure titles that had come before. Beyond that, its slippery handling doesn't make for as solid of gameplay experiences as its earlier 3D predecessors. Even Heroes, the closest released and most similar game in style to Shadow's mechanics, feels significantly more polished and enjoyable to play. Despite that, Shadow is distinct in one specific way that is not inherently bad, despite its poor execution in this specific instance. The game does deserve credit for something that no other Sonic title has ever attempted, a system with a high degree of potential benefit for the series, but one that, due to the sheer amount of critical panning the game received, Sonic Team likely decided to throw out, along with the rest of the game. That system is the branching level progression system.
To date, Shadow is the only mainline Sonic title that has handled level progression in this way. And while serious consideration would have to be paid to retool it into something truly enjoyable, doing so would bring with it a progression system that could bring with it solutions to bigger problems that the 3D Sonic titles still struggle with to this day, leading to a far better gameplay experience.
But before we go into what would need to be changed, let's talk about the case study we already have and how Shadow the Hedgehog handles this mechanic.
Shadow the Hedgehog's branched objective format is represented by a moral choice system. This is represented by 3 different options that appear in most of the stages: Hero, Dark, and Neutral. Some stages, specifically the end stages of any given path, oftentimes will remove the neutral option, only permitting the player to complete a Hero or Dark objective. These 3 objective options will directly affect the kind of gameplay experience that Shadow the Hedgehog provides to the player. Players who opt for either the Dark or Hero paths will generally have a much more involved time than those who stick with the neutral path. Neutral objectives are generally only A to B formatted levels, whereas Hero or Dark generally present alternate objectives like destroying enemies, locating items, or collecting a certain amount of ring/items, etc. Essentially, every stage in Shadow combines Sonic Heroes Team Sonic stages with Team Chaotix missions, and while yes, this means that there's roughly 3 times the amount of content per stage than there would be if it was handled like a typical 3D Sonic platformer, this approach comes with several shortcomings. Not least of which is that, in addition to changing the kind of gameplay experience that Shadow the Hedgehog provides, this branched approach to level design also directly alters the amount of time that the player will spend in each of the game's stages by huge degrees. This isn't inherently a bad thing, but in this particular case, the amount of time spent in a stage can dynamically impact the player's experiences with the game, and not always in positive ways. As it stands, the quality of the gameplay varies wildly between paths, making the game a slog to complete. Some objectives are simple enough, such as finding Cream the Rabbit hidden in a clearly marked wall. Objective structures such as this usually acts like an alternate goal ring, just one that's less pronounced. Other objectives like tracking down 400 rings in a stage or discovering a certain number of secret discs, while slightly more time consuming, are nothing new to the series either, and also remain fairly harmless. However, the game's approach to multiple objectives takes a huge downturn when it comes to the objectives that require defeating all of an enemy faction's soldiers, especially in the late game. At this point, the game's pacing comes to a sudden and screeching halt. The worst offender in this regard is the Hero Path stage Lost Impact, that tasks Shadow with eliminating all of the artificial chaos enemies in the stage.
While the player will have accomplished similar goals in the game before this point, Lost Impact's semi-linear level design, as opposed to the fully linear design of previous levels, will result in a significantly longer time being spent in the stage alone than most of the preceding stages in the Hero Path combined. A new player may take upwards of half an hour tracking these suckers down, and when completed, there's still another stage and boss to go. This discrepancy in pacing and quality of gameplay may be why we've never seen this type of level progression return. However, there is no denying that Shadow the Hedgehog contains some of the most replay value of the entire series. However, this is worthless due to the game itself not being fun enough to warrant continued playthroughs. Only die-hard fans of Shadow's mangled story will find value in completing the entirety of the game. Speaking of story, another issue that arises with how Shadow handles its storytelling is the fact that the vast majority of Shadow the Hedgehog's plot is completely worthless. By the nature of the branching path system, obviously Sonic Team had to include incentive for players to experiment with which objectives to pursue at a given point in the game progression. The decision was made to have each branch include its own self-contained plots and conclusions, allowing for plenty of different narrative paths to choose from. The problem is, due to Sonic Team already establishing Shadow as something approaching an anti-hero, as opposed to an outright villain, the implementation of the morality system renders everything between the opening cutscenes and the last story entirely irrelevant in the best case scenario, and entirely non-canon in the worst. While some fans have done their best to piece together what could be considered the closest thing to a canon path, at the end of the day, there isn't one. Meaning, the only reason to play through this game more than once is either to unlock the last story in the adventure-era game tradition, or to experience the merits of the gameplay itself, and your mileage is going to vary wildly on that one. While we've established that there's not a lot of actual value in Shadow's replay value, looking at the building blocks of its approach to branching level progression is something that holds a lot of potential for future titles if handled in the correct way. But if Shadow handled it incorrectly to mixed results, what would the system being used correctly look like?
The idea of replayability is one that the best of Sonic titles have always kept in mind with their design philosophy. From the use of multiple paths and hidden special stage rings in the classic titles like Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Sonic Mania, to the ranking system encouraging skill mastery in games like Sonic Adventure 2 and the modern titles like Unleashed and Generations. In the same vein, a branching path system holds immense amounts of potential for future Sonic games, taking the idea of the classic's multiple paths and pushing it forward to the next logical step.
The potential becomes clear when you boil away the execution from the concept. Besides unlocking alternate stage paths via objectives, what if all three win conditions in each area were simply alternate gold rings? When thought about in depth, the idea of multiple level exits goes hand in hand with the strengths present in the classic titles, namely the ideas of speedrunning and exploration of alternate pathways.
Branching stage paths in previous Sonic games have always been limited by the fact that they always reconverge to a single endpoint, with negligible exceptions like Starlight Zone in Sonic 1 or specific zones during Knuckles' route in Sonic 3 and Knuckles.
By applying three possible endpoints, or hidden endpoints, as in the case of Shadow, each representing a divergent path in terms of the following zone, each zone could theoretically triple in replay value without the need of the degree of padding modern Sonic titles are infamous for. Modern Sonic titles have become infamous for padding out the experience of newer games with either prolonged 2D sections to avoid the additional difficulties required in creating full 3D stages, in addition to gimmicks like Classic Sonic to give the 2D another flavor to further pad out the experience to acceptable length, and sometimes not even that in the case of Sonic Forces.
Reintegrating Shadow's multiple path approach, however, might allow for a much more fleshed out experience, making each stage itself more dense and ripe for exploration, as opposed to resorting to making dozens of 1 minute to 2 minute long straight line zones. Assigning different difficulty levels to the routes of each goal ring would also tie into skill tiers, another huge strength of the classics that has never been fully capitalized on in the 3D Sonic titles, resulting in a deeper gameplay experience in addition to a longer one.
Shadow the Hedgehog's issue with irrelevant plot could also be easily remedied by simply having all paths reconvene into a single finale, but with each path resulting in a different final zone. Let's say, for instance, the final zone is one of Eggman's bases. Following one level path may lead you to infiltrating the base through the basement, from which you need to work your way up. Maybe another will have you bursting through the front doors in typical Sonic bravado, and a third may perhaps have you airdropping in from the tornado. This can be even further extrapolated beyond just the route-specific cutscenes of Shadow if Chaos Emeralds were also scattered along each respective route, requiring the exploration of all possible routes to obtain all 7, which in addition to the usual supersonic reward, could also unlock a final ending, Doomsday, from S3 and K style.
While this type of level design sounds ambitious on paper, it can be illustrated in a very straightforward way with a great example outside of the Sonic series, Star Fox 64. Despite occasional vehicle changes, Star Fox 64 remains true to its core gameplay style throughout the entirety. By accomplishing many feats of skill, different routes through 64's level open up for the player, with the more difficult objectives yielding a more difficult progression of levels.
In the case of an almost entirely on-rails experience like Star Fox 64, these objectives being things like successfully passing through narrow arches and other such displays of mastery of the control scheme make sense. But in a series like Sonic, replacing such objectives with different degrees of platforming challenge would result in a similar style of gameplay, just shifted to better fit a platformer.
A bare-bones arcade experience such as Star Fox 64 almost requires this degree of replayability with tests of skill and mastery in order to be long enough to be considered a standalone product. It achieves this with shocking little amount of padding, something that the modern Sonic titles often stumble with significantly. While it's true that an on-rail space shooter would probably be far more simple to apply a system like this to than a momentum-oriented 3D platformer, Between Shadow's excellent example of reusing and reappropriating duplicate assets from other stages but changing them just enough to be distinctive in every stage, with use of different layouts, lighting, textures, and gimmicks, with substantial alternate paths, figuring out a way to bring these two formats together seems like a match made in heaven for the Sonic series. We saw this executed very well in games like Sonic Adventure 2 and Shadow the Hedgehog, where assets were often reused in multiple stages, but simple things like particle effects, lighting, stage-specific gimmicks, and level geometry were remixed to give each stage its own personality, diminishing the amount of discernible repetition for the player.
Modern Sonic titles have always had an issue with padding overshadowing the core gameplay, and to see a game that came up against the same kind of problem but resolving it in a way that doesn't degrade the overall product as a whole brings up the question of why another attempt at a branching pathway system using a more Star Fox 64 philosophy hasn't been tried before.
With the amount of value on both the consumer side as well as the development side, in addition to reintroducing a multi-tiered narrative structure often pined for by the fans of the adventure formula titles, there is a huge potential in Shadow the Hedgehog's branching path system returning for a future Sonic title.
With some revision, refinement, and retooling, the branching path system could provide a varied, contrasting gaming experience but still allowing for a more focused experience that won't cause an untenable production cycle on the part of the developer.
It could cut down on the pace-breaking padding and quick fixes currently plaguing modern Sonic titles, but still offer a ton of replay value in length to ensure that players feel as though they get their money's worth from such a title. Shadow the Hedgehog may have gone down in history as a disappointment if we're using the kindest terms. Even so, even the worst of titles in the Sonic series oftentimes have kernels of good ideas that could bring forth a unique, positive experience for the Sonic series if reattempted with a different mindset or design philosophy.
Shadow's multiple path system is only one of a slew of different ideas Sonic Team experimented with during the mid-2000s, during the adventure and dark eras. Sometimes all an idea needs to be a good one instead of a bad one simply comes down to execution. What we laid out today is just one possible scenario in which a solid mechanic could not only lead to a good experience, but one that could elevate a Sonic title further by solving multiple problems of pacing, padding, and substance that has eluded the series for many years now.
Who knows what kind of awesome experiences are possible with just a fresh take on an old idea. And since it's Sonic Team we're talking about, there's definitely plenty to go around. But for now, that's all I...
Wait, hold up. We finally got the TheKazeBlade on a video. I've always been wanting to do a collab with you since your Sonic Forces video, so it was great having you here, man.
I can't tell you how happy I am that we finally were able to collab. I didn't really have plans to do a video anytime soon until you brought it up. Every time I feel like I've gotten away from the Sonic series, it just pulls me back in.
Oh man, do I share your pain. I'm still trying to find my way out. Alright guys, and be sure to check out his channel in the description below.
For now, that's all we got. Have a good one.
And swag out.